looks like party with a K-A. Yep.
Awesome. So Missy Partyka joined the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium in 2018 as a member of the Gulf of Mexico Sea Grant Oil Spill Science Outreach Team. Based in the Auburn University Marine Extension and Research Center in Mobile, Alabama, she serves as an extension specialist to audiences in the region and around the country interested in learning more about oil spill science. With a PhD in integrated ecology from the University of California, Davis Partyka came to Sea Grant with a record of working closely with the public to research complex environmental issues with potential human health impacts. During her career, Partyka has worked on all 3 U.S. coasts and in the Caribbean as a marine scientist. Although she was living in California in 2010, she followed the Deepwater Horizon oil spill with great interest, having obtained her master's degree in coastal ecology at the University of Southern Mississippi's Gulf Coast Research Lab in Ocean Springs. Partyka originally hails from Roseville, Minnesota, and obtained her bachelor's degree in marine biology from Eckerd College in St. Petersburg, Florida. She lives in Ocean Springs with Ronnie Bond, her husband and colleague, and their dog, Lady Jane. Awesome. You can go ahead and get started, Missy.
Thanks. Okay, are you able to see my first slide?
Yes.
Okay, great. So as Carrie was saying, I'm Missy Partyka. I'm with the Mississippi-Alabama Sea Grant Consortium. I'm based in Mobile. A little update to that bio. When that bio first got posted, I was living in Ocean Springs, Mississippi, but now I'm living in Mobile. Still with the same husband, same dog, so that part hasn't changed. So today I'm going to be talking to you about how my team, the Gulf Sea Grant Oil Spill Science Outreach Team, talks about oil spill science, and now that we're at the 10-year mark, some of the new things that we've learned. So to begin with, those of you that aren't familiar, the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative is a non-penalty endowment that was funded by BP right after the oil spill. It was $500 million dedicated towards researching the impacts of the oil spill. Initially, all of that money, or the first slug of money, was focused on rapid response and how to get around the immediate impacts of the oil spill. But then eventually, after a couple of years, started moving toward long-term focus on modeling, tracking, prevention, as well as improving communication between different agencies and organizations and research institutes. Right now, we're at the 10-year mark, and that is the sunset year for GOMRI, as it's called. And so we're looking at synthesizing all the information that has been learned over the years. There's different core areas out there that are focused on specific things, whether it's modeling or the impacts to habitats or organisms or human health. And they're going to be beginning to roll out their synthesized material. And I have the great pleasure of then, with my team members, of being able to then turn those synthesized materials into outreach documents. So 10 years might not seem like a very long time, but in terms of research, it's an age. And when you've got $500 million worth of research just from one institute being poured into the Gulf of Mexico, that's a lot of research that's been going on. So there's been 80 different research consortia, large groups of different researchers coming together from a lot of different backgrounds. 269 different research projects to date. That's over 4,200 people that have been funded through this program. And that's undergraduates and graduate students and postdocs and researchers and staff members and folks along the way that have contributed to this science. There's also more than 3,000 publicly accessible databases out there. So you yourselves, if you're interested, can go and find some of these data and start poking around in them yourself. If you're thinking about starting a master's degree, or if you're already in a master's program, those data sets are also out there for you to contribute to your own theses. There's a lot of research, as I said. We're looking at almost 1,200 publications just from Gulf State researchers alone, which means there's a lot of stuff for us to synthesize and a lot of stuff for us to go through. And we'll be talking about all of that today. But I can tell you through these synthesis activities, we've learned a lot about the Gulf, the different organisms that are here, habitats, and how the ecosystems are responding, not just to the oil spill, but changes in our climate and other big disturbance events like hurricanes. We've also improved our modeling abilities. We've gotten a lot more knowledge about different types of mathematics that should be used, improved our technologies, which has allowed us to increase our forecasting capacity, not just for oil spills in the event of a spill, but even things like harmful algal blooms and understanding how those things track across our coast. So a lot of this research that all of the researchers have been conducting doesn't just end at 10 years, and it doesn't just end with an oil spill, but there's information we've learned that carries us beyond that one narrow field. So all that research is going on, but who actually gets to see it? If you're like a lot of different folks, you might not have access to peer-reviewed journals and publications, or if you do, you might have a hard time pulling through all of that information in order to get the answers that you're looking for your particular project. That's where I come in. So I'm a member of the Oil Spill Science Outreach Team, part of the Gulf Sea Grant programs, where we're across the entire Gulf of Mexico. As I said, I'm based with Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant in Mobile. I have a background in integrated ecology as well as human health. So that's the area I kind of focus on for the team. We have Monica Wilson. She's based with Florida Sea Grant in St. Petersburg. Her background is in oceanography. Emily Mung Douglas is based at Louisiana State University. She's with Louisiana Sea Grant. Her background is in ecotoxicology. Danny Bailey is one of our newest members. She just moved down to Texas for Texas Sea Grant, Texas A&M, right at the beginning of this pandemic. So just a couple weeks before we all kind of went into lockdown, she moved down to Texas from Mississippi. So it was a big change for her, and so we're all thinking about her right now. But our team is also organized by Steve Sempier, who's also with Mississippi Alabama Sea Grant. He's our team coordinator. He's based in Ocean Springs. And then we also have a team communicator, Tara Skelton, who's also in Ocean Springs. So that's my team. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to be talking about today aren't necessarily things that I've done, but members of my team have done over the past several years. We've been together as a team for the last 6 years. And that means that we've got a lot of experience working with one another and understanding each other's strengths and weaknesses. And so we can come together with a team and come up with our best products possible. So one of the things we specifically target are different audiences. We don't necessarily provide our materials for the general population or through K through 12 education. There's other members of Sea Grant that focus on those particular target audiences, but we really focus on any of the folks that are living on the coast that require a healthy Gulf to live, work, or play. And that kind of covers these organizations we see here. We have elected officials, responders, nonprofit organizations, such as shelves, fishing industry, natural resource managers, etc. So those are the audiences we're targeting when we're trying to create these outreach materials. So how do we do that? Advance. There we go. And it went a little too fast, and that's okay. So we start off by getting questions from our target audience members. We want to know what they're concerned about. We want to know what they have questions about, just like I'm going to be opening it up for questions today to understand where your concerns on what you want to know more about. It doesn't do me any good to do a bunch of research on a different oil spill topic to create an outreach document that nobody actually wants to use or really cares about its content, because that's not something that is of concern to them. So we go out to our audience members, we do input sessions, we solicit feedback following workshops, and after that we dig into the available research. We use government reports, we use peer-reviewed literature, we use good quality science in order to help create these documents, a lot of which I'm going to be talking about today. So we have physical outreach documents, we have multi-page outreach documents, as well as single-page kind of fact sheets, and we do seminars and we do workshops and we hold additional input sessions, and then we do the whole thing over again in order to keep this iterative process going. And that's led to 32 different outreach documents to date, and we're still making more. So I'm going to be talking about several of these today, but before we do that, I want to do a little check-in with you. So I know you're usually told not to be on your phone or fidgeting with other devices when you're in the middle of a lecture or a presentation, but I'm going to ask you to do just that. So if you have a secondary device, or maybe you have a second screen, I want you to go onto a web browser and go to menti.com, MENTI.com. And once you get there, you're going to see a space to type in a code, 137094. And some of you are already answering, so you can see this. So the first question is, how old were you during the Deepwater Horizon oil spill? Just to kind of get a feel for the audience, how many of you guys maybe were still in high school when this was going on? Some of you might be a little bit younger and not have been in high school yet. I don't know if there's any old souls on here. There were a little bit grayer in the hair like me while this was going on, but that's great. At least one person was under the age of 10. I'm not sure how many of you folks are actually online. We still got folks coming in. So we see 31 responses, 32. Oh, you guys are great. I'm so glad you're catching on to all this. I'll just give it a moment more. Any last comments out there? Going once, going twice. Oh, one more snuck in. Okay. Oh, a couple more. Okay, we're going to stick it at 40. So it seems like the lion's share of you were in that 10 to 20 bracket right there. So you were in high school during this. So this next question is, where were you during Deepwater Horizon? And this allows you to physically type in words. And each of you can answer a couple times if you like. There's more than one way to describe it. You can use more than one word. See, folks are putting in the state that they were in at the time. You can also say, I don't know, I was living with my parents, or I was going to summer camp, or look at that, landlocked. See? That's fun. See, folks were in homeschool. Somebody was busy being 8. Somebody was in their 8th grade geology class while this was going on, going to college for the first time. Lots of folks from Pennsylvania. Thank you for joining us today. Alabama folks. Shout out to Philly. There was a number of members of our team, past and present, that have family associations with not just the PA, but Philly in particular. And folks from Virginia, Illinois. That's really interesting. So once all these results are into, I want to let you know that I'm going to be saving these, exporting them as a PDF. So you'll have access to my slides, but also pass this along to y'all as well. I mean, it's kind of fun information. It was somebody's birthday. Okay, 59 responses. That's pretty impressive. Okay, now I know a little bit about all of you. Oh, still coming in. 60. Okay, I'm going to leave it at there. Thanks, everyone. That went much more smoothly than I was prepared for. So thank you all for being tech savvy, at the very least being able to use your phone effectively. Okay. As promised, I'm going to go into some of our outreach documents and some of the things we've learned. I'm starting off with seafood because that's something that a lot of folks down here in the Gulf have been concerned about, but we also know some of our visitors that have come down to the coast that are visiting from other parts of the country. Big questions that we heard at the time was, is the seafood safe to eat? But it's questions that we even still hear to this day, 10 years later. People have heard rumors that maybe the seafood industry was ruined, or there's no more good seafood down here, or they're importing it all and selling it as, you know, local seafood. So I'm going to go a little bit about the impacts to not just seafood itself, but the seafood industry. So after Deepwater Horizon, almost 40% of Gulf waters were closed to fishing initially, and that was the immediate reaction of saying they need to close the maximum amount of area to be protective of human health and to make sure fish and shellfish weren't being taken from an area that potentially was exposed to oil. That led to a standard protocol being put into place that I'll go into a little more in depth of how those waters were then going to be reopened to make sure it was safe to sell those foods on the market. We know at the end of it, 22,000 samples or more of different types of seafood were collected, and none of those actually exceeded the federal standards for safety. But we know that there's different levels of safety depending on the different communities and their consumption rates of seafood. So federal standards are based on certain average body weight of individuals that are eating seafood and average amounts of consumption across the entire country. But we know folks on the coast sometimes eat a lot more seafood than the average person in the country. We also know that some of our communities have people that are not of average weight or size. For instance, down here on the Gulf Coast, we have a large number of Southeast Asian communities that are big part of the fishing industry, and they might be a little bit smaller of stature and weight than the average American. And so there were questions about whether or not those standards really improved food safety for everybody down on the coast. We'll talk about that a little bit too. Most of the federal waters were opened by the following year in 2011, but there were state waters that remained closed until 2016 and then had some big impacts on local economies if they're not able to go out and fish their local waters. So the program I was talking about that was in place to ensure that the seafood were safe followed a multi-step process. To begin with, they looked out in places to see whether or not there was any oil or if there had ever been any oil that had been reported. If no oil was currently present or had been reported, they might send planes out there to confirm the presence or absence of oil. If it had never been reported, then that place might be reopened right away. Then sampling took place. So if it's a place that had been previously oiled, there wasn't any current oil, they went and took a bunch of samples and started analyzing those samples, and they were taken from different depths across different species from different areas to really understand what was the impact to the seafood. Those samples then would go into what's called olfactory testing. So essentially there were experts that were really good at detecting the smell and taste of oil in seafood, and that's called seafood taint. So if the folks were going through and eating raw and cooked seafood and didn't smell or taste any taint, then those samples would go on for chemical testing. And only once they cleared chemical testing for those regulatory thresholds were those waters reopened. One of the things that people have asked about is whether or not it was just up to somebody's nose whether an area was opened again for fishing. And I can tell you that there were no samples that were found to be tainted or not tainted that were not either leading to the place remaining closed or going on to additional sensitive chemical testing. So rest assured on that. We know that none of the samples that were collected ever exceeded the regulatory standards set by the FDA for safety. But as I said, there are some questions about whether or not all communities were protected by those levels. And that's some research that's been ongoing. We do know, though, there was a long-term impact to a number of our Gulf fishing industries with lack of trust in not only the testing, but concern over whether or not the fish were safe to eat or whether or not they were somehow mutated or deformed. There were questions about that. But I can tell you right now that we're happy to report the seafood industry is beginning to boom. COVID obviously is taking an impact on those community members, but the oil spill impacts are no longer being seen in the fishing community. Next, I'm going to talk about some impacts to birds. We know that birds were impacted following the oil spill, both as individuals and as populations. That has led to potential reduction in breeding, maybe reduced hatching. Newborn survival rates have potentially been lower depending on the different types of species. We also know that there's potential damage to the nesting habitats, which could have long-term impacts on migration patterns or the success of different bird species. I don't know if you heard that, it just got really windy outside, sorry. Bird species and for future generations. I also wanted to point out, oops, let me go back one, that the use of Dawn soap for cleaning of birds and impacted species, while might look very effective, researchers have found that there's not necessarily any increase in survival between oiled and non-oiled birds that had been cleaned with some kind of surfactant or soap. And a lot of that has to do with drying time. So what they found is that if they cleaned a bird, like a pelican, for instance, and immediately released them and it didn't allow their plumage to dry, that basically had the same impact as being exposed to oil, where maybe they would suffer from hypothermia or some of the other things I'm going to be talking about. So the impacts to our bird species were multifold, and it really depended on the type of birds, what their eating patterns were, what their flight patterns were. We know that there was a lot of damage to their plumage, so impacts to their feathers, and that could have a lot of different impacts to them in general. For one, we know birds preen. It means they're cleaning their feathers with the mouths, and that can lead to ingestion of oil. We also know certain species of birds, like cormorants, have an oily or don't have an oily coating on their feathers, and they really rely on being able to get out and dry their wings in order to reduce hypothermia, and the presence of that oil prevents them from being able to dry out effectively. During that preening, they can also ingest oil, which can have other toxic effects. So not only could they be ingesting oil physically by eating prey that maybe is contaminated by oil, but they could be ingesting it when cleaning themselves. And so researchers have found impacts such as organ damage, where they've seen a decreased ability for them to produce antioxidants from their liver to help break down those oils, which has led to some anemia. That increase in anemia means they're not effectively carrying oxygen to the rest of their blood supply, which can lead to increased exhaustion and the inability to carry on other tasks like feeding. We know it can also have impacts to migration patterns. So for instance, oiled birds might have a hard time staying in formation or keeping up with the lead bird. Increased exhaustion might be exhibited, particularly if they've had a hard time eating effectively and they're anemic, so they're not getting the oxygen they need to travel. We can also see increase in longer trips, which mean it might miss time where they need to be hitting resources in different parts of the country, particularly in the flyway between Canada and the Gulf of Mexico. We also know that there could be really longer term impacts, and some of those things are still being seen, and research is going to have to continue probably well beyond this 10-year period. We know the Natural Resources Damage Assessment estimated that 39% of gulls, 30% of pelicans, and 13% of terns, just to name a few, were lost from the Gulf following Deepwater Horizon. Now, those losses are from actual physical death of birds that were collected and counted, but it's also from estimation of loss of future generations, lack of nesting being counted, and so we know that if birds aren't reproducing, then that's a long-term loss to those populations. But as I said, we're also expecting to see the impact of the loss of habitat. I'm going to be talking a little bit more about habitat too, but when you have the loss of marshes or mangroves or sandy shores that birds rely on in order to make nests, they're not able to make babies. And that means year over year, you might see a decrease in the number of young birds coming into the population. And so after 10 years, we know our bird populations in the Gulf have still not recovered. Change for me. Okay, there we go. Sometimes it's a little slow. So as I said, we know that there are impacts to some habitats, and one of the habitats I'm going to talk about is mangroves. So for those of you up in the PA, I'm not sure how many mangroves you had seen if you've traveled down to the south at all, but mangroves are usually compressed in their range to being down in the Gulf of Mexico, the eastern seaboard, really kind of Georgia, and south of there around Florida and into the Caribbean. We know that with global climate change, we do have an expansion of the range of mangroves, but generally speaking, those are a southern species. But they're an incredibly important southern species. Not only do they provide habitat for a lot of commercially important species and rookery space for a number of different birds that are on their migratory pathways, perhaps all the way down to Mexico, they also help stabilize our shorelines and reduce water pollution by taking up nutrients and holding back sediments. We know that mangroves are really sensitive to oil, however, and those impacts can be multifold. So looking at this little graphic, there's a lot of different things that can be impacting our mangroves. We know that they can have both lethal and kind of sublethal effects, and they can have direct and indirect impacts. So for instance, you might have direct oiling of mangrove roots. And mangroves are really unique in the fact that they kind of breathe through the water a number of different ways. They might have propagules that actually come up through the sediment and are able to actually exchange oxygen right through the root system right there as they're down in the water. And if those get oiled at all, then we don't have an exchange of air, which means that you are not getting oxygen to the system, and trees need to breathe just like other creatures need to breathe. We also see the potential for it actually closing off the ability of those roots to carry water up and through the tree, which means the tree might start to dry out. As it starts to dry out, you might see a loss of leaves from the canopy. And as you have a loss of leaves from the canopy, you might see increased light penetration into the shallow waters, and that increases the temperature of that water and increases the salinity of the water, putting additional stress on those communities and leading to further death in those mangrove populations.
Just
Sorry about that. I'm not sure where that feedback's coming from.
Just a reminder for everybody to keep their mics muted during this. All right, I think we're good though. You can continue.
Okay, thanks. So as I said, we kind of see primary and secondary impacts. For instance, researchers found that the tips of those roots, when they're exposed to oil or oil with dispersants, might dry out, meaning they can't carry water. And if they're drying out and can't carry water, then those trees might die. And if those trees might die, then it can lead to increased shoreline erosion and loss of shore habitat and land. And given the fact that mangroves are important for shoreline stabilization, particularly during hurricanes and large storms, the loss of those plants that are closest to land can then have increased impact on those living near the shoreline. We also know that oil can penetrate down into the little burrows and holes in a mangrove forest, and that impacts the little organisms that are living down there, whether they're crabs or fish or snails or worms. And that means that they might die or they might move on. And those are the base of a lot of the food supply in the mangrove forest that commercially important species rely on. So you have the loss of that food supply means you might have the loss of those fisheries as well. So we might continue to see long-term impacts of any mangrove habitat that had been impacted following the oil spill. The good news is that I can tell you that most of the mangrove habitat in the US is really centered around Florida, and Florida did not get that much direct oiling. And so while future oil spills might have a greater impact on mangrove habitats, we're pretty grateful that a lot of our mangrove habitat here in the Gulf of Mexico were not impacted by Deepwater Horizon. Okay, so I'm going to take another little break. Let's go back out to Menti. And this is going to be a little quiz, but nobody knows who you are, so you don't have to worry about that. I just want to see if you're paying attention. Give everybody a moment. It's going to count down, I believe, and then we're going to do a little quiz. It's real easy. It's multiple choice. Everybody's little faces. Okay, we're starting the quiz. If you remember this. Five seconds. Time's up. Okay. I mean, technically it's called taint. It is contamination, but the word we're looking for that's called taint. Just seeing if you're paying attention. Okay, go back to my presentation. Okay, a couple more things, and then we'll open it up for questions. So one of the other groups of organisms that we saw impact from Deepwater Horizon oil spill were deep water corals. Now, these aren't the corals that we're snorkeling next to, or that we hear about a lot of times when we hear about coral bleaching or those types of coral impacts. These are corals that are generally down deeper than 500 meters or so, and it's dark down there, it's cold down there, they're really long living. But we know that Deepwater Horizon had a really negative impact on some of those coral communities. These deepwater corals rely on hard surfaces, exposed rocky ground out in the Gulf in order to settle and grow, and those habitats are at a real premium. We know that the oil spill right near the wellhead spread to the surrounding habitats and impacted it there. We also have seen longer expanses of impacts across a defined geographic area in the Gulf. We know from studies, because these colonies were already being studied prior to the spill, we see impacts of pre and post pictures from some of these colonies. And we know that there was up to an increase of 50% loss of individual colonies that were being studied, including erosion of the different individual little polyps or overgrowth by competitors, residue that you can physically see on the corals, and I'll show you some pictures, or breaking and loss of branches. So this little graphic here is a cross section of a generic look at the seafloor. So the shallow water corals that I was talking about that we're used to snorkeling around didn't show a lot of different impacts. They weren't really exposed to oil. We're talking about the deep sea zone corals down deep. So we know that the octocorals that are down there, as I said, need hard surfaces in order to settle down. Those hard surfaces are patchily distributed across the Gulf, but we know that over 770 square miles of ocean bottom around that wellhead was actually impacted by oil. And that oiled habitat then is not available for future generations of these little corals to settle on and begin to grow. As I said, they're long-lived. They take a very long time to grow. Some of these corals can be hundreds of years old, so the loss of the habitat for future generations to begin to start to grow can have a significant impact on the populations in general. So we're able to get down there and look at these corals by the use of manned and unmanned submersibles. And as I said, one of the greatest things about some of these hard coral communities down here is that they'd already been studied for years. And because they've been studied for years, we've got some pictures of what some of these colonies looked like before the oil spill. Now, the time series of pictures that I'm showing you here is from several months after the start of the spill to a couple years later. In this first picture you see, this is an octocoral, it's a gorgonian coil, it's kind of what's called like a sea fan, and it has a little brittle star buddy in the middle. And you can see this black clumpy sludgy stuff kind of on the branches on the outside. We look at a month later and you can start to see maybe there's not as much of that sludge, but you start to see the breaking off of some of those branches. Moving a couple months down the line, you start to see maybe the loss of that black stuff, but we've got the death of some of those branches and other things called bryozoans, other things that like to grow on hard surfaces, start taking over this coral. And you can see by October of 2011, he's lost his little buddy in the middle. His brittle star that usually hang with the same octocoral for life is no longer there. And by March of 2012, that's effectively a dead coral. Now, if there hadn't been any pre-studies done, or if we had only looked at this coral colony maybe in March of 2012, we would have seen it was dead. We wouldn't have necessarily been able to associate that with the oil spill, because we don't see any physical signs of oil right now. So it's really important to have these long-term studies to understand these impacts of these communities that we're not able to easily see. So like I said, loss of habitat can lead to impacts for our future generations. We know our shallow water corals were not impacted, but we have a really firm understanding of what is necessary to restore some of our shallow water corals, but we do not have that same understanding of what restoration looks like for some of these deep water corals. Finally, what I'm going to end up here is something on a little bit of a good note, or at least what I think of as a positive note, is our increased understanding of technology and our ability to study some of these systems. So like I said, we wouldn't have been able to know about those deep sea corals if it hadn't been for the use of manned and unmanned vehicles. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how those technologies were used during the oil spill and what that technology is really, how that technology has been used and how it's helped us do other types of studies in the future. So these types of vehicles can be basically broken down into three different types. You've got remotely operated vehicles, and those are things that are physically tethered to a support vessel. They've got like basically a cord that holds them on there so they can't get away too far, but that also limits the range and how far away they can get from a support vessel that's up on the surface. Some of you might have heard of like the Jason. The AUVs, autonomously operated vehicles, get programmed and they get sent on their merry way, and researchers hope they come back again because they cost an awful lot of money. And then there's human operated vehicles, and those are ones that usually have viewing windows or maybe a big bubble on the surface that allows researchers to go down with the operator so they can actually see the habitats that they're working on and make decisions about specific samples that they want to take. And maybe you've heard of Alvin before. I've had the pleasure of being able to go down in an HOV before, and I can tell you that it's pretty amazing. Transition slide. Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about one of these just briefly. So the AUV Sentry is one that is from Woods Hole Oceanographic Institute, and it was brought down in order to help research pinpoint and track where that underwater plume of oil was that some of us had heard about. We had the plume of oil that was coming out from the wellhead, and a lot of it came to the surface. But there was also a subset of the oil that was moving laterally across the seafloor that never made it to the surface. So researchers needed to be able to track where that plume was going to understand the impacts to the surrounding environment. So they programmed this little AUV to spiral on down through the water column and start doing a zigzag pattern to try to track this oil plume. They thought they knew where the plume was going to be, and so they had programmed it on a particular trajectory. It had sensors on board that were actually detecting polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, some of those chemicals that we know are harmful to humans that are in the oil. And what it found was that it had lost that signal and it was not detecting it after a short period of time. So researchers were actually able to contact the AUV down below the surface of the water, reprogram it to start zigzagging in a different way where it would turn back around every time it stopped sensing the PAHs that were down there. And using that technique, it was able to map that plume out for 22 miles down at 3,600 feet, which is pretty impressive. And then while it's down there, it had onboard cameras that was able to take pictures of habitat and stuff that then could be used to do other types of dive for researchers. So one of the great things that actually came out of all this research money being funded down here is we had a better understanding of habitat, we had a better understanding of the distribution of the oil spill, but those technologies that were developed in order to rise to the challenge of this really devastating event are able to be used for other types of research now and are available, ready to be deployed in the event of another disaster. And not just here in the Gulf of Mexico, but up on the eastern seaboard if there was a spill, say, up in Pennsylvania or off the coast of Pennsylvania. We also know that long-term monitoring is important for everything, but these vehicles are very expensive to use and to operate. So it's really incumbent upon the federal government and state agencies and different institutes out there to continue to seed grant support to some of these institutes to keep these technologies going so that we can continue to learn and deploy them in the event there's another disaster. So one last time, one last quiz. Remember, nobody knows it's you. You can be as wrong as you want to be. Okay, that's the leaderboard for last time. I said nobody knows it's you. I lied. Okay, last quiz. What is the name of the animal that lives its life attached to deep sea corals that I was talking about? Eight seconds. 3, 2, 1. All right, I did call him a little buddy, so that's fair enough. Okay, and with that, I'd be happy to take any questions you might have, provided we've got a little bit of time left.
Awesome. Thanks, Missy. And I'm going to switch it over to Matthew for the questions. But real quick, I know we have some people on the phone, so I wanted to give them an option since they probably can't put in the chat box their question. So if anybody on the phone wants to unmute themselves and ask a question, feel free. If you are on the web, please put your question in the chat box and we'll make sure to get to it. So Matthew, if you want to just give maybe the people on the phone a quick minute, and then you could start off with the questions in the chat box.
Anybody from the phone? Okay, well, we have some questions from the chat, and see, I'll pick out the ones that are like a lot of people asked first, but something that's kind of on everybody's mind is Cody's questions. If Cody, you want to ask yours, you're online and available.
Let me find it. There it is. How much longer will the Gulf of Mexico take to recover from the Deepwater Horizon incident, and has the oil spill affected other bodies of water besides the Gulf?
So that's a great question. Was everybody able to hear that? How long is it going to be until the Gulf recovers from the oil spill, and did it impact other bodies of water other than the Gulf? So that's kind of a loaded question, Cody. It's a good one, and it's something that researchers are still trying to figure out. It depends on what you're talking about. So we talk about how long are we going to continue to see impacts in our marsh habitats, for instance, or how long are we going to continue to see impacts to our dolphin populations? Those are different questions. We know something, for instance, the impact to whales and cetaceans. So our dolphin populations were heavily impacted following Deepwater Horizon. They are a long-lived species, and when we have reduced birth weights or reduced ability to actually carry a fetus to term for some of our dolphins out there, or other cetaceans, that means we have generational impacts on communities, which we might not see recovery for many, many years to come in terms of getting back up to pre-spill population levels. Now, we know that, for instance, there are some habitats out there that rebounded fairly quickly. And for instance, the marshes around Louisiana, there are places where, depending on the type of recovery method that was employed, recovered much more quickly than others. The responders, when they were going out to an area that was oil, had a lot of different types of tools in their tool belt. And there wasn't always clear idea, because the research didn't exist, which ones were going to have negative or positive impacts. And so different types of cleanup strategies were being used. And some of those were more effective than others. For instance, they went into places and they physically raked out oil from some of the marsh places, and that actually ripped up the marsh and actually removed it and sometimes made it worse. In other places, they might have done a controlled burn where they actually burned up the oil in the area, and burning up that oil, while it reduced that immediate vegetation and maybe killed some of the organisms that were living right there, effectively rapidly removed a lot of that oil and allowed the marsh to sprout back a little faster than those areas that have been raked. Now, water quality has 100% returned to normal, so we're not seeing those long-term impacts in our ocean currents, or things that we're not able to go out and take a water sample in the Gulf of Mexico and still find Deepwater Horizon oil. Part of the thing too is in the Gulf of Mexico, one of the reasons there's a lot of oil and gas exploration here is because we have a lot of oil and gas, and that means there's a lot of natural seeps that come out. So we have oil and gas are bubbling to the surface throughout the Gulf of Mexico, which means there's always just a little bit of a low level of PAHs and other oil chemicals that are always in the water, but we've not been able to find any evidence that Deepwater Horizon oil is still present in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, your second question about other bodies of water that may have been impacted. Based on modeling studies that were originally done, it did not look like any of the oil got entrained or trapped, as it's called, in currents that would lead it to go out into the Caribbean or the Atlantic. But we do know from recent studies that there is new modeling that has come out that have shown some of the chemicals associated with the oil, even if not the physical oil that we could see, some of the chemicals associated with that spill might have made it into the Gulf Stream and traveled out through the straits and out into the Atlantic seaboard. We don't necessarily have proof that that existed, but newer models suggest it could have happened. I hope that answers your question.
You did, thank you.
So hard to say, huh? A lot of these things.
It depends. It's a big gulf. There's a lot of stuff out there. And even with all the research that's been done, there's still a lot of stuff that we don't necessarily know.
Okay. And then we had a bunch of people who wanted to know on like your favorite things that you've done. So why don't we have Amber ask her questions? I think she encompasses it very well.
Sorry, I had to scroll up a little bit. My first question was, what has been your favorite subject to research since you started at Sea Grant?
So that's interesting. So like I said, I'm an ecologist by trade, so I enjoy interactions between habitats and organisms and understanding going up through food chains. And a lot of the research that I've done here has been reading my team's documents. When I came on board, it was the summer of 2018, and my team had already been in existence, pumping out all this great material. For those of you that know Larissa, she was part of my team and was the author of a number of these publications. And so I spent a lot of time, reading what they had already boiled down and summarized in order to come up to speed on this. But one of the things I've spent the last year working on is the impact of harmful algal blooms and how that looks similar to our coasts from the impacts of oil. They might sound like they're not at all related, and we're not saying that harmful algal blooms and oil spills go hand in hand, but they impact our fisheries, they impact our health, they can have impacts on habitat, changing the economies. And so I've actually had a lot of fun digging into that type of material and understanding how those things relate to what we already understand about the oil spill. And part of the reason looking at this too is that, it has been 10 years since the oil spill. And one of the things I told you that, we do as a team is we get input from our stakeholders in order to understand what to research next and which questions to answer. And a lot of our stakeholders have said, we're not that worried about the oil spill anymore. We kind of worry about this thing that's going to hit us next summer or is hitting us right now, and that's a harmful algal bloom, for instance. So I like a lot of it. I've had fun, learning more about the impacts to sea turtles, or my colleague Emily Mung Douglas from Louisiana, she had a workshop that was all on those underdogs of the marsh, as she called them, those little unseen creatures, small hermit crabs and worms and things like that, or what we call like uncharismatic megafauna. So the little critters and things that nobody cares about, those are a lot of fun for me to research too.
Other question was what is the most interesting fact that you've uncovered in all this research?
Oh, that's interesting. What is the most interesting fact that I learned? Oh, one of the things, I don't have the slide in front of me, so I might misquote like the numbers, but while looking at the impact of the seafood industry and people being concerned about seafood consumption, about where those levels are, those thresholds for what makes it safe, is that some researchers did a calculation and they found that in order to rise to the standard of you consuming enough for it to potentially have a negative health income, you'd have to eat something like, I don't know, like 63 pounds of seafood a day for the next 5 years in order for it to reach the level of you actually potentially having a negative impact. And it breaks it down between types of fish and how many oysters and pounds of shrimp and all these things. But I remember like reading that, I was like, wow, that is like an extreme eating challenge to be able to like eat that much seafood every single day. So we tell people those types of figures in order to assuage their fears just a little bit, that it's unlikely that even if they go to the casinos and are going to all-you-can-eat buffet of shrimp or something like that, they'd be hard-pressed to get that much poundage into their bodies.
I'll take that challenge. Yeah, so Boris had a good question about like what we can do to help the public. So if Boris wants to ask that one, if Boris is available.
Sure, can you hear me?
Yep.
My question was, what are some resources that you guys have that we can share with like members of the general public?
So all of our research documents, all of our outreach materials, all of our webinars and seminars that have all been recorded, all of that is available on our website. And if you're still to see my slide right there, if you go to gulfseagrant.org/oil spill outreach, so we have over 32 different published outreach documents, and those are all written to be at the high school level or below, all with a glossary with vocabulary terms if we had to use more scientific information, all with pretty pictures, all with links to different resources that folks can go to with like, federal reports, for instance. And so those are all available to the general public. We distribute them out through our Sea Grant network. We have places throughout the Gulf that we have them on display. For instance, the Navarre Beach Sea Turtle Rescue Center down in Navarre, they have a number of our documents, our outreach publications there all the time. They regularly reorder them and they frequently give them all away. So we've got one, for instance, on sea turtles or on the impacts to sands and beaches. Because that stuff is available on our website and we put it out in aquariums and estuariums and things like that, that's a great way for us to make those resources available. We also do have links to other types of resources on our website. And as I said, any of the trainings or workshops or seminars that we conducted have all been videoed and are available on our YouTube channel.
Awesome. Thank you very much for that. And I had two parts to my question. They're not pertaining to each other really. The other question was, what are some current issues that the people like the general public should be aware of that the Sea Grant program is currently helping with or working on?
So that's a great question. As I said, one of the things that we're working on a lot right now is the impact from harmful algal blooms. That's
Right.
something that is a big deal in the Gulf of Mexico in general, but also across the US. So we're beginning the formulation of what's called a community of practice within Sea Grant to get what had originally been supposed to be a Gulf of Mexico community of practice for harmful algal blooms is now going into a nationwide one. So we're working with our partners in the Sea Grant offices up in the Gulf, or up in the Great Lakes, in the Eastern Seaboard, folks in California and Washington that have had issues associated with harmful algal blooms. And we're helping to consolidate materials, figure out what kind of additional research needs to be funded, work through initiatives that improve forecasting. I can tell you right now that a lot of our Sea Grant offices are really focused on COVID-19 and how we can support our community members. Living down here in the Gulf and knowing that our communities were so hard hit following Deepwater Horizon after being recently hit by Hurricane Katrina, and we know that hurricanes come in every year. A lot of our community members, our fishing organizations, our tourism organizations, our small mom and pop, paddleboard shops, etc., are really being hit economically. And so we're doing our best to try to make resources available to them, show them how they can apply for different grants and loans. We're conducting peer listening training right now that we can get our Sea Grant agents and others up to speed on understanding how to recognize when some of our stakeholders are suffering from depression and anxiety or going through undue stress, so that we can help just provide an ear where necessary or refer them. So I know that a lot of our Sea Grant offices right now are kind of all in on this. But on top of that, we've got the Great Red Snapper count is going on in the Gulf of Mexico and has been for some time. And now we're launching this new amberjack initiative to start really trying to understand the impacts to some of those larger pelagic and commercially important species, to understand long-term trajectories to the health of that fishery. So kind of a lot of stuff.
Very cool. Thank you for answering my questions.
I think you've answered most of the questions in the chat that, from what I can see. So if anybody else has any questions they can think of and want to ask out loud, now would be the time.
I was typing it, but I can just ask it. What was the effect on the recreational fishery and the recreational fish like redfish and sea trout and stuff like that?
So it's interesting. So the impacts on some of those recreational species is varied. So one of the things we know is that the oil came on shore and hit habitats patchily. So it wasn't uniform across the entire Gulf, and even places that, even a section maybe of a shoreline that had been received a lot of oil didn't mean it was like uniform across there. And because of that, there were some habitats that were hit worse and others that weren't hit as badly. And what we saw sometimes is a shift in where those populations maybe were moving to. So maybe some place had been a great fishing spot and all the guides used to bring folks there. And if that habitat had been highly impacted, populations might have shifted. Another interesting thing that researchers found is that even though we know the oil could have severely detrimental impacts on individual fish that were exposed, maybe increasing the birth defects from that particular fish's, what's the word I'm looking for? Progeny. It doesn't necessarily show itself on population impacts for a lot of different reasons. One of the reasons is that it's patchy out there. But something that I don't want to say is a positive outcome from the spill at all, but what we did see is because fishing areas were closed for an extended period of time, there were some populations that maybe had been hit more regularly that were kind of given a pause button and allowed to rebound a little bit. And so some of our guides out there have also really increased their knowledge of the impacts from oil spills. And so researchers and responders are able to tap those types of communities, charter fishermen and local guides to figure out, where have they seen impacts, where have they seen populations rebounding, and also for them to start recognizing that they might need to spread out where they're bringing to a little bit, because they saw such heavy impacts following Deepwater Horizon, and they want to ensure that those populations, are safe and healthy moving forward. So while it was a hard lesson, there was quite a bit of environmental education that went on to the fishing community, both commercial and recreational, following the spill. So a lot of those populations, the drum and trout and stuff, we haven't necessarily seen population impacts. If anything, it's more of an impact potentially to their habitat that takes time to rebound.
Awesome. Thanks for all those answers, Missy, and a great presentation. Just to keep us on time, it is close to 2 o'clock. So if I can just ask you to maybe go back to your first slide with your contact information, and we can pull that up in case anybody wants to jot that down. We can leave that up on the screen.
I don't know if I have my contact information on that slide. Can I chat it?
Oh, yeah. Whoops. I just assumed, I think. So yeah, it'll be in the chat box. And then you said that you're going to be sending out the presentation as well. So you can just,
if you just tell me like where I should send that to, or if there's like a list of registrants or something like that, I'd be happy to make